Hello, ghouls. Welcome to the 35th episode of the Shrouded in Darkness podcast, where we shine a light on the cases that the world forgot. This is your true crime obsessed host, Marlena. Let's look at our sources for the case. Wikipedia, the Morning Cup of Murder podcast, NCPedia, and the Weirdsdale Podcast, which is a new favorite, by the way. Today's case takes us to the Carolinas. We meet Margie Velma Bullard, born October 29th, 1932, to Murphy and Lily Bullard in rural South Carolina. One of 9 children, and we come to know her as Velma. While still a young child, Velma's family moves to North Carolina. And I believe this is where Velma spends the majority of her life going forward. Velma was raised by an abusive father and a mother that refused to intervene. At 16 years old, she started dating Thomas Burke. She became active in a Baptist church, attending with Thomas and his parents. After a year of dating, Thomas proposed and Velma accepted. This was her ticket out of an abusive home. At first, the newlyweds lived with Thomas's parents. After 2 years, they welcome their first child. Around this same time, they find a place of their own. By 1953, so this would be when Velma was 21 years old, the couple welcomed their second child. 2 years later, in 1955, Velma is out walking when she's hit by a drunk driver. The injuries seemed to be minor, but her mental health took a major toll. And this continues until 1962. Velma is forced to have a hysterectomy when she starts severely hemorrhaging. And from everything I've read and heard about this case, this is really when things kind of started changing for Velma. Like I said, she had already started having some mental issues, and then now she has to have a hysterectomy. And this was a time when technology wasn't that advanced, medicine wasn't that advanced. So this caused a lot of changes in her hormones, her feminism, her rights as a woman, and so on. Around this same time, Velma also started having back pain. So between the surgery and that pain, she started getting prescribed medicine, specifically pain medicine, and she would later develop an addiction to that medication. In 1965, Thomas is involved in a serious car accident. This brings on a drinking problem. Perhaps the alcohol helps with the pain, maybe it helps with the trauma of the accident, or maybe it's to cope with Velma's behavioral changes. I'm not really sure, but it definitely caused an even bigger downhill spiral for the couple. They start fighting and arguing, and Velma feels like she's right back where she never wanted to be, in an abusive home. So we move on to April 1969. So this would be about 4 years after Thomas's accident. Velma and kids are out for the day. When they return, their home is in flames. Thomas, who remained at home while they were out, would be found inside, where he passed out and died from smoke inhalation. By November of that same year, Velma has started dating Jennings Barfield. Like Velma, he is a widower. He's not in the best health. He suffers from diabetes. So in August of 1970, the two marry. And then March of that next year, he dies of heart failure. I want to add a quick note. From time to time, it does seem that Velma ends up in the hospital for overdosing that same pain medication that she's been prescribed. And this actually continues to happen. I know it happens at least once in 1970, again in 1971, and at least once or twice more during her adult life. After the death of Velma's second husband, Jennings, she moves in with her mother, Lily. Now, there are conflicting reports on whether or not her father was still living at this time, because around this same time, he died of lung cancer. But we know for sure she's living at home with her mom. So while living there, she actually starts writing fraudulent checks from her mother's account. And in 1974, Lily starts showing symptoms of vomiting, diarrhea, nausea. She recovers after a few days, only to get sick a few months later. I think this was around December. She started getting sick again. Same symptoms, but this time she doesn't pull through. Another conflicting report, some sources say Velma was dating a man that died in a fatal car accident. This would have been around the same time as her mother's passing. So I'm not sure if this is true or not, but I'll let you know just in case. Velma's habit of writing bad checks catches up to her in 1975. She serves 6 months in prison. It's possible she was relieved after 3 months. Again, conflicting reports. We see a lot of that in this case. Well, after her release, she begins working as a home health aide nurse, which honestly kind of sounds crazy considering what she was in prison for, that people would welcome her into their homes. Anyway, her first client is an elderly couple, Montgomery, 94 years old, and Dolly, 84 years old. This is the Edwards. In January of 1977, so this will be about a couple years later, Montgomery dies. And a few weeks later, in February, Dolly falls ill with a stomach virus and succumbs to that sickness. So next, we meet another elderly couple, John Henry and Record Lee. On June 4th, 1977, so this is the same year that Montgomery and Dolly pass away, John Henry dies after experiencing, you guessed it, severe stomach pain. Okay, next we meet Roland Stewart Taylor, who happens to actually be a relative of Dolly Edwards. Like she had done with her mother and possibly others, Velma starts forging checks under Roland's name. In February of 1978, Roland falls ill with the same symptoms we've seen before: diarrhea, vomiting, nausea. But what's different about this, when he passes away, this time they perform an autopsy. And they find an arsenic-based poisoning. Velma is quickly arrested. Quick note. One source I read says that Velma's own sister helped in getting her arrested because she called the police and told them that Velma had been poisoning Roland and others. So Velma does admit guilt. She confesses to poisoning Montgomery and Dolly Edwards, John Henry, and her mother Lily, but she denies all the others. Now, I'm not sure if this happens before or after her confession, but we do see that a few people from the past are being exhumed. Jennings, for example, that was her second husband. He was one of those bodies exhumed, and he was found with traces of arsenic in his system. Again, though, Velma denies any involvement in his death. We also see Lily Bullard and John Henry exhumed. Also, they both show signs of arsenic poisoning. We move into December of that same year, 1978. Velma Barfield is found guilty on one count of first-degree murder for Roland Stewart Taylor. She was sentenced to death by gas chamber. And I'm not sure why she's only charged with the one murder, because like I said, they found traces of arsenic poisoning in multiple people that she would have been around. But regardless, she's still going to prison. She's still being sentenced to death. So Velma was imprisoned in Raleigh, North Carolina, and she was put in an area for escape-prone and mentally ill prisoners. Why? Because there was no designated area for women on death row. This wasn't a normal thing for prisons during this time. Women were never sentenced to death. Well, during her incarceration, Velma becomes a devout Christian. She even connects with evangelist Billy Graham. And I'm sure a lot of y'all have heard that name. It's a famous evangelist name. And possibly his wife, too. They connected with Velma. So her final years were spent ministering to prisoners. We move on to November 2nd, 1984. At 52 years of age, Velma Barfield becomes the first woman to be executed by lethal injection. This was her choice, by the way. She chose the lethal injection as opposed to the gas chamber. And in her final statement, Velma says she's sorry. She also thanks everyone for their support during her time in prison. And just an interesting random fact, her last meal that she chose, cheese doodles and Coca-Cola. Now, there are a few interesting facts about this case. This may or may not warrant mentioning, but just in case, I'll read these to you. Some reports state that Velma suffered from split personalities. So much so that one of those personalities was named Billy. And it seems Billy first made their appearance when Velma started getting sexually abused. Now, we know that Velma was raised in an abusive home and her first husband started becoming abusive as well. But I haven't really found anything stating that she'd been sexually assaulted. So, again, not sure how true this statement is. Another interesting fact, singer-songwriter Jonathan Bird. He was the grandson of Jennings Barfield and his first wife. And Jonathan has a song called Velma on his Wildflowers album that gives a personal account of the investigation. Lastly, Velma earned the nickname Death Row Granny. Now, these cases where the where the suspects have nicknames using terms like Granny, I kind of hate it, because the term Granny is supposed to describe that special grandmother in life, someone that's nurturing and good and wholesome. Yet we're seeing more and more cases where that name Granny is used to describe a person that is evil. It's insane to me. I'm not sure if we'll ever know how many victims suffered at the hands of Velma Barfield. I mean, it could have started with her first husband, Thomas Burke, and it could have included as many as 7 victims that we know of. Thomas Burke, Jennings Barfield, Lily Bullard, her mom, Montgomery and Dolly Edwards, John Henry, and then Roland Stewart Taylor. So what are your thoughts on this case? What are your theories? Let's hear them. You can reach out to us, as always, on social media like Instagram and WordPress. Just search for the Shrouded in Darkness podcast. As always, thank you for tuning in. And if there's a case from your hometown that deserves attention, send it to us. Tune in next week as we discuss the case of Angela Simota. Until next time, ghouls, remember, the truth is always hiding in the darkness.